first reading is Psalm 30, reading from the book of Psalms. I will extol you, O Lord, for you have drawn me up, and did not let my foes rejoice over me. O Lord my God, I cried to you for help, and you have healed me. O Lord, you brought up my soul from Sheol, restored me to life from among those gone down to the pit. Sing praises to the Lord, O you his faithful ones, and give thanks to his holy name. For his anger is but for a moment, his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may linger for the night, but joy comes with the morning. As for me, I said in my prosperity, I shall never be moved. By your favor, O Lord, you have established me as a strong mountain. You hid your face, I was dismayed. To you, O Lord, I cried, and to the Lord I made supplication. What profit is there in my death if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it tell of your faithfulness? Hear, O Lord, and be gracious to me. O Lord, be my helper. You have turned my mourning into dancing. You have turned off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy, so that my soul may praise you and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
The second reading is from the book of Galations. The Apostle Paul tells the story of his ministry given to him by Jesus Christ. In the midst of tension in the church in Galatia, he assures his readers that his work is centered in the pure gospel of Jesus Christ, unlike the other teachers among them. For I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin. For I did not receive it from human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. You have read, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. But when God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles, I did not confer it with any human being. Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me, but I went away at once into Arabia, and afterwards I returned to Damascus. Then after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and stayed with him for 15 days. But I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. In what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only heard it said, the one who formerly was prosecuting us is now proclaiming the faith he once tried to destroy, and they glorified God because of me. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Last week we began our 6-week film series on the life of Paul and heard a lot of what was just read, only in a film version. So today we're going to take off from this part in his story and go with him into his first missionary journey into Turkey. So if we can have that now, please.
What would lead a first-century rabbi to travel thousands of miles by sea and by land, to be beaten, imprisoned, and ultimately beheaded for his faith? It was a call to turn the world upside down. This is the story of the Apostle Paul, whose writings continue to shape the lives of 1/3 of the world's population, a man second only to Jesus in his impact and influence on the Christian faith, and whose witness defines what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. After Paul and Barnabas were set apart by the believers in Syrian Antioch, they made their way to the coast and boarded a ship that would have looked something like the one you see here. And they would have traveled thousands of miles on ships like this across the course of, or Paul would have, over the course of the next 15 years, 20 years. And they made their way to Cyprus. Now, Cyprus was Barnabas' hometown, or home island. This is where he was from. And Barnabas, John Mark, his younger cousin, and Paul make their way to Cyprus. They travel across by land as they're ministering, as they're preaching and offering Christ. And then finally, they leave the island of Cyprus and make their way by ship over to Perga. Now, Perga was no small city. It was a major city here in this particular region. It was the capital city of the province. And though Luke doesn't tell us much of what happens here, only that they entered Perga, and then later on they came back through and Paul proclaimed the gospel, what we know is that Paul, Barnabas, they entered through these city gates as they began their missionary journey in Asia Minor. And so we enter through these same gates today. And we remember the fact that Paul walked here in this place as he was launching his mission to Asia Minor. In Perga, you find fine examples of great ruins from the time of the Apostle Paul and earlier. And then you see this amazing main street with really two roads going through it. So you have a very large example of a cardo or of a marketplace with the main streets with shops lining the streets. So Paul would have traveled from Perga up the plain alongside the Sestris River, which we're standing in front of now. An old Roman road ran along the Sestris River and made its way up into the mountain pass through the Taurus Mountains and up to Pisidian Antioch. And so you can see, many people picture Paul, traversing across desert-like, or dry, flat terrains in Turkey, but that's not what he was walking across. He was getting ready to cross the Taurus Mountains, ascending 5,000 feet to go to Pisidian Antioch. It would have taken him about 3 weeks to make this journey, I think, because he would have had to stop where there were water sources along the way. So he and Barnabas making their way along the river as long as it traversed, and then along the Roman road up the Taurus Mountains to Pisidian Antioch. Let's head that direction. After traveling for 2 or probably 3 weeks, Paul and Barnabas finally arrive to the town of Pisidian Antioch. They have traveled across the mountains you see in the background, the Taurus Mountains, and they've come up in elevation to a city that's probably 3,000 to 4,000 feet above sea level. And in Perga, the temperature there was about 10 degrees warmer than it is here, but the relative humidity was about 90%, whereas here the humidity's low, the temperatures are a little bit lower, and so this would have been a place that was much more comfortable. Some have suggested that Paul was sick. In fact, Paul says that he came to Galatia and preached there because he wasn't feeling well because of his illness. He came here, and so perhaps that had something to do with the temperatures in this region. I'm standing on the Roman road leading into the city, and as we walk into Pisidian Antioch, I just let you know this was a large city built on a hilltop. It was a city of some 15 to 20,000 residents. That's a huge city in Asia Minor at the time. He'll come to this city 4 times in total. So on each of his missionary journeys, he's going to come here. And on this journey, his first journey, he comes here twice. As he enters the city, he begins to preach. And as he's coming back from visiting the towns of Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, he's going to come here again. So let's make our way into Pisidian Antioch. This is one of the main streets coming through the town of Pisidian Antioch, and there's no question that Paul walked up and down these streets many times in his 4 visits to this town. And as you come in, you see the old Roman stones, the old Roman road, and then you see that the streets are lined with shops. So everywhere you look, on every side of the main streets, and this was true in almost every Roman town, really almost every ancient town of any size, as you had shops lining the streets. And so today we think of open-air malls as sort of the new thing in shopping for Americans, but this is how people shopped in the Roman Empire. And the size of it was maybe 12 feet by perhaps 8 feet. And the shopkeepers would offer their wares here. People either come in or they'd be served from the entryway. And you can still see here where the door posts were and where the locks would go to keep the shop locked at night. So this is an example of shopping in Pisidian Antioch. At the high point of Pisidian Antioch, the town of Pisidian Antioch, stood a temple. It was the center of town. Everybody could see it when you came into town. And that temple was dedicated to Augustus Caesar. He was deified and considered a son of God, as well as Lord of the universe and King of kings. And this temple was meant to honor him. And in this city, Paul came, and he was announcing a different kind of King of kings and the Lord of lords, the Lord of the universe, and the Son of the Most High God. And as he came and preached that message in this town, there were some who were immediately drawn to it, and others who were angered by it. And ultimately, they would throw him out of town. Paul was a rabbi and a Pharisee, and he was trained in preaching and in teaching. And so his strategy when he would go and share the good news across the empire on his missionary journeys is he would start with the Jews. He would go to the synagogue. And as he was asked to proclaim or to teach on a particular passage, somehow he would always find a way of tying that passage back into the gospel of Jesus Christ. Behind me is a church that was built in the 300s, and it was dedicated to St. Paul. And this church, some believe, was built atop the site where the old synagogue had been that Paul first preached in when he came to Pisidian Antioch. And he goes through in what is the longest recorded sermon of Paul found in the scriptures here in Pisidian Antioch. He begins with God's deliverance of his people from slavery in Egypt. He takes them to King David, and then he talks about how the descendant of King David, Jesus, was the Messiah, who suffered and died and rose again, and how he died for the forgiveness of sins. And then he invited people to become followers of Jesus. Now, on that first day, the Jews and the Gentiles were very interested in what he had to say, and when he came back the next week, so undoubtedly he was teaching throughout the week, but when he came back to the synagogue the next week, Acts tells us there was a huge crowd of people. And many of the Gentiles in particular were drawn to this Jewish Messiah, Jesus. And yet that upset many of the Jews in the synagogue who then turned some of the Gentiles of the town away from Paul. And after that second week, Paul and Barnabas were asked to leave the town. In fact, they were really almost driven out of the town. So Paul leaves Antioch and he travels eastward to the cities of Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. If you were to visit these sites today, all you'd find is large hills. These are called tells, and they're man-made hills. The cities would be destroyed by earthquake or war or fire, and then the people would rebuild the city on top of the old ruins. And they would bring in a layer of dirt, they would flatten things out, they would start all over again. And then when that city was destroyed again, another century later, it would be flattened out, and a new city would be built on top of the former remains. And so over time, the cities were built up higher and higher, and then when the city was finally abandoned, nature took over and it just became a large hill. Archaeologists love to excavate these sites, and as you begin to strip away layer after layer, the lower you go, the further back in time you're going. But today, all we can see are just a few ruins and rocks that spring up from the soil, and then these large hills, and we remember it was in these places that Paul proclaimed the gospel and started some of his first churches in Asia Minor. Barnabas, whose name was Joseph, was given the name Barnabas by the disciples. And in the book of Acts, it says they called him Barnabas because Barnabas means son of encouragement. It literally means son of a prophet, but for them it was son of encouragement. And Barnabas was the one, you'll remember, who went and found Paul after his conversion and assured the believers that it was safe to be with Paul. He took him to Jerusalem and introduced him to the apostles. It was Barnabas who found Paul when he was in Tarsus and brought him back to Syrian Antioch to be sent out on the mission field. And it was Barnabas who said, I'll go with you. I'll go with you on this mission. He was an encourager to Paul. Paul needed that. He needed his encouragement. He needed his wisdom. He needed him to come alongside him. And the same is true for every one of us. We all need an encourager. We all need a Barnabas in our lives, somebody who comes alongside us to encourage us, to give us strength, to help us have wisdom, to walk the right path, and to do the things that God calls us to do. But listen, you're also called, every one of you, to be an encourager, to be a Barnabas for someone else. There's somebody who needs you to come alongside them, to mentor them, encourage them, to stand with them, to give them courage. So I'd ask you this question: who is your Barnabas? And for whom are you a Barnabas?
You enjoying these little movies? Yeah. Rick Steves, maybe some of you have heard of him, does this for a living. For PBS, he travels all over the world, and he's a Lutheran, by the way, from the Seattle area, I think, and so we kind of have a version of that today. Last week we started this series, and I know a lot of you weren't able to be here because of the holiday weekend, so I wanted to just briefly review a couple of key ideas from that time. One of the thoughts was that Paul's life is like a puzzle, and it has very important pieces in it that are shown there on the screen that were used in his life and his journeys in various ways to help the gospel move along. And it was mentioned that our lives are like that too, aren't they? We have pieces that make up the puzzle of our life. And part of it is our family that we grow up in. Part of it is our education. Part of it is what we do for a living eventually. Maybe our passions, our hobbies. All these things kind of make up who we are and can be used by God to help His kingdom go forward. A second idea that was brought out last week was about Paul's ambition. In the passage on the left, which was actually read today, you notice in the kind of the white words there that he says, I was advanced in Judaism beyond many, or I was far more zealous. He was a zealot, we would call that, by far. And that picture that you have on the screen is an old one that shows him on the far right approving of the stoning of Stephen. That's what that is meant to show. And that event was really one of the illustrations of what he's saying, that I was a zealot for my tradition. And that carried him to Damascus. And then the third thing that we talked about, among some other things, is that faith seeks understanding. And sometimes we have a desert time or a time where we got to sort out what our faith means. For Paul, after his conversion, he had some time in the desert and also some time at Damascus, 3 years altogether, before he went on to do any more preaching or missionary work. And St. Anselm of Canterbury put it in a kind of a good way, I think, that faith seeks understanding. First, we come to faith as a child after hearing the stories of Jesus or reading about God in a story Bible or coming to worship or whatever. And then the rest of our life is trying to make sense of what that means. You know, and so we come each Sunday, or we read things at home, or we're in small groups, and we're just trying to make sense of what does this mean for our life. Well, I want to talk today about a couple other connections to the film that we saw, and one of them is that how did Paul get going on this journey? It was a call of the church when they were in worship, just like this. That's an important idea, I think, for us. You see the reference there on the left-hand side of the screen from Acts chapter 13 that mentions what happened. Paul had been waiting around for 14 years from the time he was converted until this time. 14 years of waiting to go out on this first journey with Barnabas. That's a long time to wait. Now, in 3 weeks from today, we're going to have a guest speaker from the place pictured there on the screen, which is Wartburg Seminary in Dubuque. And Josh Geyer, who was pictured, I think, on a prior slide during the loop, will tell you that day that the role of a congregation is crucial for lifting up candidates for ministry. Crucial. Future pastors, future missionaries are sitting in a room like this morning, all across the country, all across the world. And the Spirit is calling people in places like Iwalu, Bible camps, or campus ministry sites at our state universities, or at church colleges, or on high school or college mission trips, such as the one that our own youth director is going to go on today, heading to Malawi in Africa. And this call is especially important today. I want to really lift up today kind of what's going on in our ELCA in the last 10 years. We have a department in Chicago that keeps track of these things, and I just pulled out a few statistics from a several-page report that came across my email a while back. And just look at some of these statements. In 2014, just a couple of years ago, half of ELCA congregations were in rural areas or small towns under 10,000 population. Half of them are in those kind of places. Those are the places a lot of us grew up, right? In these rural churches or real small town churches. The average worship attendance for a weekend, not for one service, but for the whole weekend, for any ELCA church, you just add up all the numbers, divide by about 10,000 ELCA churches. Look at that, is 70 people. Okay, that's little, isn't it? That's little. But that's the average. So that suggests the churches that are really big and kind of have a lot there are being offset by a ton of little churches having 30, 40, 50 people or less even in worship. I like the next one that talks about churches our size, which is over 350 in worship. And look at that. The number of congregations our size shrank by 300 in that decade. So in other words, we are one of those now 376 that worship more than 350. And enrollment in ELCA seminaries declined by over 40% in that decade. Now what does that mean? Well, let's go to the next slide, which talks about the relationship between retirements and ordinations. Just picture kind of a revolving door, okay? And you've got, in 2010, you had 315 people like me retiring, but you had about 300 going in the door, right? So you're pretty much the same, 15 more left than came in. But look what happens in this decade, how in 2012 there are 110 more retiring than being ordained. 2014, the number jumps to 175. 2016, this year, they project 236. And then it kind of drops back a little bit in 2018 to 212. So what's needed is obvious. We need more people to fill that second column, don't we? People to go in. And you know, most people that go in today are not right out of college, but they are second career people. And some are in their 50s and 60s and even 70s who have finished one career in their life and feel a call, sense a call, and are able to go. And so the question is, who might God be calling today? Maybe even in this service for this work. And when Josh comes to us in 3 weeks, he'll talk about some creative new ways to get this education. It's no longer true that you have to go physically, let's say, to Dubuque, Iowa, and live for 3 years and then go out on internship for 1 year in order to make this happen. They realize that's hard for second career people especially. So they're coming up with ways to do a lot of this online, to stay right in your community to make it happen. And that's a good thing. Well, another connection to the story that we heard Adam tell is about the gospel and how it proclaims simply forgiveness of sin and freedom. The passage on the left there is a little section. It's the core of his sermon that Paul preached there in Pisidian Antioch. And if you wonder what the gospel is, there it is on the left-hand side of the screen, okay? That's what we mean by the gospel. It's got all the elements of what we mean by the gospel. Through this man, forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. By this Jesus, everyone who believes is set free from all those sins which you could not be freed by the law of Moses. But after he said that, about a week later, as Adam pointed out, a lot more people came, including some Jewish people, who said, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. It's all about the law and keeping the law, whether that's the 10 Commandments or a lot more to it that is found in the Old Testament. And then Paul, later on in that passage on the right, said, I'm astonished, you people of those places we just saw in the movie. I'm astonished that you're believing that lie from those people that follow me around. And you're going to see that as a pattern all through these films. People would come later on and say, what he said to you was wrong, and you need to, for example, be circumcised if you're going to be a true believer, or you need to do various other things that the law taught. And he calls those things a false gospel, saying, no, you are saved through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, period. It's not a matter about you being a good person back then or today. It's not a matter of you keeping the 10 Commandments back then or today. It's about trusting in Jesus to save you, not trusting in yourself to save yourself. And one last connection comes from how hard it is to say that word in any culture, because perhaps it is just our human nature that we want to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. We want to believe God helps those who help themselves, including our salvation, which isn't in the Bible, by the way, that statement, God helps those who help themselves. And so faithfulness to this kind of countercultural message will bring trouble to Paul and to preachers and to people that try to be faithful. And it requires perseverance. You see on the left there, that little illustration is of what happened to Paul on this journey we heard about today, where he is literally stoned. The one who approved of the stoning of Stephen, isn't this ironic, is now the one who is stoned by people he used to be with, the Jewish people. And they think he's dead when they're done. But he revives and goes on to the next town. And the amazing thing to me is then he comes back to that town that stoned him to see how things are going. Now that's courage, isn't it? We don't often think of Paul having courage or guts, but isn't that something? That you would come back to the very place that tried to kill you and share the gospel again and try to check in on how everybody's doing? That's pretty amazing. Perseverance. The best verse I know about perseverance comes from Hebrews 12 that we'll use as a closing prayer. So let us pray. Oh God, let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Amen.